After 2011, social movements in Chile sparked new forms of appropriation of public space and raised the question of the public and private condition of urban space. These movements demanded for new reforms in education and also in sustainable development. In this regard, the session on public space that we will have now will consider projects where design contributes to expand citizenship and democracy. Questions that are related to this category are Chilean contemporary public spaces responding to these new demands for citizenship and democracy? Are these public spaces available to all? What are the innovations that the exercise of citizenship has pushed in public space? And how can contemporary designs meet people's requirements? To set the frame for this discussion, we will have first the presentation made by Romy Hecht. We will see not just the three cases, but also the reason or the script behind those three cases, an assessment by Stan Allen, and a discussion which will be moderated by Galia Solomonoff. And before having Romy Hecht, let me present then the three actors that we'll have. Romy Hecht is an architect from the Pontificia Universidad Católica of Chile and a PhD in history and theory of architecture from Princeton University. Her research focuses on theory, history, and criticism of 20th century public landscape. Her dissertation, The Attack on Greenery, Critical Perceptions of American Man-Made Landscape, 1955-1967, has been presented at Princeton, Harvard, Columbia, and Rice University. And also her essays have been published in journals such as Harvard Design Magazine, ARQ, CA, Revista 180 in Chile, and New Architecture in China. She translated to Spanish J.B. Jackson's The Necessity for Ruins and other essays. Also, she has been visiting assistant professor in the GSD. Currently, Romy Hecht is assistant chair of undergraduate affairs and associate professor at the School of Architecture of the Pontificia Universidad Católica of Chile. To assess Romy Hecht's presentation, we will have Stan Allen, which many of you may know. Stan Allen is an architect working in New York, and George Dutton, professor of architecture at Princeton University. From 2002 to 2012, he was dean of the School of Architecture at Princeton. He holds degrees from Brown University, the Cooper Union, and Princeton. His architectural firm, Stan Allen Architect, has realized building and urban projects in the United States, South America, and Asia. Stan Allen has received prizes such as an Academy Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the PA Award, the John Hedges Award, and the AIA Award. His architectural work is published in Points and Lines, Diagrams and Projects for the City, and his essays in Practice, Architecture, Technique, and Representation. His most recent book, which we were lucky to know of last year, is Land for Building, Architecture's New Terrain in 2011. The moderator of the discussion will be Galia Solomonoff, professor at this school. Galia is the founder and director of Solomonoff Architecture Studio. She received her master in architecture from Columbia University and was awarded the McKean Prize for Excellence in Design. Prior to funding SAS, Solomonoff founded Open Office. She taught at Princeton, the Cooper Union, Yale, and currently at Columbia University. Her work appeared at the New York Times, the New Yorker, W, Art News, Art Forum, Donuts, and so on, etc. Solomonoff collaborated in several books, including Latin American Architecture, and is working on documenting Latin American architecture, a documentary and book project. Her writing aims at the recognition of Latin American architecture's cultural relevance. Please welcome Romy Hecht.
Okay, so of course I need to begin by thanking everyone that made possible this event, and of course for the chance to assess, as Francisco said, the public space situation in Chile through 3 projects. So let me see if this works. Perfect. So in the last 2 decades in Chile, landscape architecture has slowly achieved increasing visibility and disciplinary identity, both as an incipient profession and a field of study. Nevertheless, contemporary debates claiming landscape as a form of urbanism and favoring planning's emergence from the landscape project contrast with Chile's commitments with the scale and nature of the design and management of open public spaces. The 3 projects selected for this presentation have dismantled the notion of what is considered good design for public open space in the country. They claim landscape as an expression of social culture instead of works that combine and shed their context to become postcards of a place and time. The 3 projects were conceived as encompassing urban, social, and cultural factors, but hardly fit the nomenclature traditionally associated to the field of landscape architecture. The 2 squares in Santiago by Fundación Mi Parque were determined by the adoption of effective land management implemented through a range of design strategies. A sequence of promenades and esplanades by mobile architects in 2 of Valparaíso's emblematic hills were conceived as a progressive response to the economic, environmental, and infrastructural challenges of contemporary urbanization. And the park by Teodoro Fernández Architects claims landscape as a form of, quote, architectural urbanism, a notion recently discussed in some circles, consequently adding another layer to the field's identity in spite of what has been considered a renaissance in the form of landscape urbanism. As you know, unfortunately, abandonment, poverty, and delinquency are some of the concepts frequently attached to descriptions of the reality of public spaces in Chile's lowest income areas. To confront this situation, the main goal of Fundación Mi Parque is to provide them with formal urban identity, not necessarily through breakout design, but through the redefinition of the concept of private management of public spaces in neighborhoods without funds to maintain them. In order to do that, the Foundation has built a synergy between communities, enterprises, and municipalities in a process of design, community liaison, building process, and maintenance. This process, showcased here in 2 of the 52 projects in 28 districts in Santiago, includes 4 stages. First, the identification of problematic urban sites. Second, the development of a citizen participation model, first of all for the site's neighbors who acquire an active role in every stage of the project. Second, for the sponsor companies through the participation of their workers as volunteers in the project's construction. And finally, for the municipalities that make a commitment to maintain the projects in the future. The third stage consists in the recovery of sites through a so-called adequate design, considering soil repair and leveling, addition of vegetation according to the climatic conditions, and inclusion of urban furniture, irrigation, and lighting systems, among others. It is important to highlight that the process ends with a 1-day construction, including both ground preparation and the actual construction labor. The squares consider the notion of the landscape project as a product of 2 social premises. First, to achieve the maximum urban experiences, reducing to a minimum the necessary steps and operations involved in the project. And second, to transform the notion of a plaza from a design typology into a social narrative, defined as a transition between different geometries coming from the site's topography, layout, reorganization, and infrastructural traces, if you can find some. Together with recognizing the relevance of a nonprofit organization that has restored the meaning of the public space as a meeting place, as a playground, and above all, as a result of a design responding to the neighborhood's real necessities and to the future users' needs, it's inevitable not to ask how to move forward. If the public space is considered a medium to provide dignity, then it is necessary to overcome a design kit based on a sequence of grass patches and on the language of recycled automobile tires and isolated tree islands that will need several years before providing proper shade. With an efficient model of public space management in their hands, it is time now for the foundation to elaborate a design discourse able to determine the formal aspects of the landscape structure and to configure spaces of urban relevance in sites that do not have it. The next project I will present, developed in a site with similar social conditions, although in a different city, provides a possibility to understand how to do so. Valparaíso can be described as a geographic amphitheater formed by a crowdly inhabited sloping terrain that surrounds the coast around a bay. The work of model architects was part of the master plan for improving Valparaíso's public spaces, which operated through the rehabilitation in two of the city's hills, Cerro Toro and Cerro Santo Domingo. Specifically, the project can be read as an urban tissue rehabilitation and reconfiguration of Valparaíso's iconic public areas, built upon what used to be the terrain's natural ravines, streets, alleys, paths, and lookouts that also define the connectivity system between the hills and the level plan of Valparaíso. The site's organization demonstrates the spirit of the project. Opposing the traditional construction of a square, the project was laid out on existing and currently used routes that had faded under the daily use pattern. The actual recovery of the terrain through the reinterpretation of a traditional promenade delineated a frontier between the continuity of the durable pedestrian quality of the contemporary city and the precarious and scattered habitability of eroded and abandoned constructions represented as vacuum in some of the models for the project. Historically, the particular disposition of the hills has allowed constructions and public spaces on Valparaíso's higher lands to participate visually with the bay, the other hills, and with the rest of the city through the pressions and breaks between them, the same that became the natural points of main access. And the project's recognition of this condition is the key for the design team to establish a point of view about architecture and the city as a continuum, and to position public space as a building. At the same time, the authors proposed the concept of proper design as the one that eliminates architectural clichés, transforming the work into an anonymous action and at the same time into a more urban one. While the urban tissue adapts to the slopes with volumes climbing, rotating, or hanging from streets that draw any degree of horizontality, the new terrain unfolds to gain height either surrounding walls or sidewalks, fabricating the hill's public spaces with stairs that emerge as alleys, paths, and corners in every possible angle and dimension. The project also assumes this condition, replacing traditional squares by the construction of overlooks and widened streets with guardrails to inhabit the cliffs and to watch over the vale while strolling. In a way, the project reproduces Valparaíso's complex reality, arising from a particular geographic context, embracing its role as a topographical fragment by stitching together edges and the steep borders between the low city and the high city. The project acts through landform and circulation insertions while maintaining and engaging existing programs. And in a deeper level, it is a project that attempted to stitch politics and design, both key agents in the creation of public spaces. Although the design team generated an intricate and complex ground, irrigation, electrical, and landscape design, and propose prefabricated elements, not only to provide an iconic presence to the project, but to add a degree of reality to the construction process, they had to battle against the complex bureaucratic system that went from the approval of the Regional Office of Heritage Management to the National Monuments Council, to the Regional Service of Housing and Urbanization, to the departments of Municipal Public Works and the like, to the Planning Chilean Ministry, and to the National Home Office that finally signed the permits for construction. After all this process, and taking into consideration that not all the project's elements survive, the intervention reads as a connectivity strategy, taking advantage of the pedestrian networks on the hills, developing a system with a major impact within the city, incorporating the notion of public space as a medium defining an habitability platform. As a result, the project embraces an urban social articulation of the territory, promoting the improvement of life conditions, and more important, the rescue and development of an urban identity through design. In the same terms, the next project builds upon the construction of a park compromised with its territorial condition. For 75 years, the National Stadium has been the public space that has gathered the largest number of civic, sports, cultural, and mass events in the country. However, since its inauguration in 1938, and in spite of the repairs to the main Coliseum, it has never been addressed as a whole site from an urban perspective. Consequently, the winning proposal of the competition organized by the National Institute of Sports in 2011 was structured around the conception of landscape design as a medium to highlight the geography and to reinterpret the traditional conception of the plaza and the street as the main public spaces in Santiago. The project is, first of all, a topographical exercise. It introduces a new dimension for the site by linking the distant landscape views of the Andes with the surrounding landscape that forms a new park. The new topography is based on the centrality of the Coliseum in the shaping of the complex design and is defined by a platform raised to the second level of the main structure, linking the site's exterior and interior through esplanades, edges, and ramps. The project also breaks the site's enclosed condition through a system of pedestrian accesses set as public spaces leading to the National Stadium. As a result, the project overlays new public spaces in a site attaching to the notion of park 5 emphases associated to the organization of the program. First of all, it is an urban park that creates a new urban system, integrating the National Stadium to the urban context, incorporating a design responding to the different borders of the site through a system of 8 pedestrian entrances, serving as public spaces, as well as consolidating its role as an urban landmark and its understanding as one urban piece. It is a topographical park that considers and enhances the pre-existing landforms within and outside the site. It is a citizens' park for the public, promoting recreational uses, including not only new programs, facilities, and events, but also the organization of the old ones. The project also preserves traditional sport uses through an organization that refers to the park as a sport campus for professional athletes, common citizens, families, and tourists. Finally, it is also an educational park that incorporates history, memory, and identity into a spatial configuration of the National Stadium, transforming it into an urban educational artifact. Despite the fact that this was an international competition that took 5 months and that was organized into 3 stages that include 27 offices, 9 of them international, and a jury composed by 8 senior government representatives, 8 national and international leading architects, landscape architects, urban planners, and to recipients of Architecture and Planning National Awards, the post-competition process to obtain the, quote, official approval of the project has taken over a year. The main contender has been the National Monuments Council, the same that declared the Coliseum under that category in 2003, and the same that at some point gave green light to the demolition of its marquee to enlarge the stadium's seat capacity after it was reduced by 10,000 seats in 2010. This operation will determine the installation of a reinforced pillar structure surrounding the Coliseum to cover at least 60% of the seats, and therefore taking over part of the area for the proposed platform. So, while the proposal won precisely because of its design and plan for the whole site, positioning the platform as a main element of the composition, according to a declaration given by a council's representative to a Chilean newspaper, they are still waiting to see and review a master plan because they have concerns with the amount of interior esplanades, the diagonal crossings proposed within the site, and the platform raised to the second level of the Coliseum, which is not a mere compositional gesture, but an actual recognition of the terrain's natural organization by absorbing the site's 2% slope, thus leveling the top of the Coliseum with a distant view. This topographical exercise and this balcony in the valley, providing a strong identity to the almost 160 acres and the whole surrounding area, and embracing the site's national and historical significance, is now at risk. And most of the effort of the team is now focused on convincing a second client about the validity of a winning proposal, using as reference similar structures such as the Ibirapuera Park in a plain terrain in Sao Paulo. So I must say, and I'm going to finish now, that governmental intervention after a public competition is not new. But if we truly believe that the public space is not neutral, something indeed confirmed by the three-site proposal I have presented, then it is time to remember, for example, episodes such as Santiago's condition during Chile's centennial celebration. Santiago's public landscape was, at the time, a complex product determined by the coexistence of productive landscapes, cultural landscapes, and landscapes built upon geographical elements, such as the Mapocho River and Cerro San Cristobal. Those urban pieces, although spread across the territory, were thought-out design proposals built not only to incorporate green areas for the citizens, but also to link the city and its valley through public spaces that operated as mediums to recognize the geographical extension of the surrounding context, a situation equally recognizable in the traditional use of Valparaiso's hills, providing its inhabitants with a sense of both urban and territorial identity. So in a period where historical large parks have been cannibalized until becoming their surrounded neighborhoods' backyards, where winning proposals in landscape design competitions are transformed by the entities that obtain the contracts to build them, and remarkable public open spaces have suffered from inadequate and progressive and controlled interventions in the hands of the authorities that manage them, countries like Chile, without a long tradition in landscape design, need to pursue the strategic instrumentality of landscape interventions that have proven to be effective, and to create design strategies that express expert knowledge in a form that can be widely used by those who most need it, the government and the citizens themselves. So, apologies, Francisco, if I bring back romanticism to the discussion, but I think that nowadays we need that perspective to envision places that could actually be something like that. So, thank you.
Put this person that put me in the middle. I can get it from both sides. Well, Saskia can do this without notes, but I can't. Okay, well, again, thanks to everyone. It's great to be here. And you know, there's also an effect that happens in conferences where there's a kind of cumulative amount of ideas and questions that are put on the table that I at least feel obliged to touch on, because the context in a way has been established by the first panel, and I think that is credit to the conference organizers, that there's a kind of choreography of these three larger topics where each one sort of inevitably builds on the previous one. You know, I should also say that I'm learning an incredible amount today. I suspect I'm learning much more. I'm learning more from you than you will learn from me today. I've been to Chile twice, and so my comments are those of an outsider, somebody with a fairly superficial knowledge of Chile, and especially Chilean cities, Santiago and Valparaiso. I've visited both. But I want to begin by restating what is not news to anybody in this room who knows much more about the situation than I do. But that is to say that the level of Chilean architecture is very, very high. We look to these practices, younger and older practices, with a tremendous amount of envy and admiration from North America. But at the same time, there's been, as has been pointed out in the introduction in previous panels, a kind of benign neglect on the part of architects of the city. And so this attempt by this conference to refocus the gaze on the city is, I think, very welcome. And even, I think, Francisco implied that maybe it was a good thing that the architects didn't mess up the cities. And now there are opportunities. And I think, in fact, the three projects put on the table here are very important. A few impressions of Santiago as a city, again, from my perspective as a foreigner. It is, to me, I recognize it as an American city. That is to say, not a European city. And I think that's partly has to do with the vastness of the city, very, very expansive. It's a dispersed city. Like North American cities, its dispersion, its sort of fairly low density depends on infrastructure. And there's something very characteristically vast about the public spaces. You don't get this sense of kind of density and enclosure that you get in a European city. But where I would differentiate it from the North American city is I find that nature is a kind of hostile presence out there, primarily in the form of the Andes, at least in Santiago. Whereas I think the North American city is much more open and porous to nature. That somehow, again, from my outsider's point of view, nature in Chile is the desert and the mountains. It's not a pastoral North American, or at least Eastern North American landscape. So I think that tension between the city that I recognize from the North American model and then what's very specific to the geography of Chile, I think, is quite important. And of course, the geography becomes an absolute protagonist in the case of Valparaiso. The other thing is this astonishing statistic that 85% of the 85, or somebody said 85, somebody said 90, but either figure is astonishing. That 85 to 90% of the population live in cities. And again, I think that kind of stark difference between the city and the countryside is something that I think is worth remarking on. A couple of points from the previous thing. This notion that the city is contested ground, that the city is a place of conflict, that in a way, if you don't have conflict, you don't have a city. So the notion that, and I think that forms a kind of dilemma for architects and urban planners, because of course architects and urban planners set out to solve problems and to reduce conflicts, and this becomes in a way the dilemma of our job as architects and planners. How do you on the one hand improve situations that need to be improved, but without ironing out all of the conflicts. The second point that came up in some of the things that Saskia mentioned is that the city is fundamentally inefficient. And again, the inefficiency of the city is one of its important characteristics. So that in fact, even though of necessity, as was pointed out several times in the previous panel, large civic and infrastructural initiatives are probably going to come from a kind of top-down government situation. Because of the fundamental inefficiency, those top-down initiatives will never be implemented exactly in ways that the people on top are thinking of, and it's the inefficiency and the mismatch in the system that actually allows room for the citizens to intervene and participate. So I would maybe less of an assessment and more of a series of questions to put on the table in the interest of sparking some conversations. It seems to me that the two large questions we want to ask are, what are the tools available to us today as architects, planners, and urban designers, where we can intervene productively in the city and still leave space for citizens to act and thrive in the city. And I think what I like about your presentation is these three projects, I think, give three potentially very productive answers to that question. The second question is, what are the different actors in the city today? We as designers are one of many. We have to deal with the planners, with the policymakers, with the financial mechanisms, which are global today, and of course with the citizens, with the people who live in cities today. So always this awareness that we're one actor in a larger sort of network of actors. And I think we have to both be aware of the complexity of that interchange within the network of other actors, but also not to lose sight of the specificity of our own expertise in that network, which I think again comes back to the three answers that are sort of on the table. And as I said, I think each one of them, in a way, is kind of exemplary in their own way, and lead me to a series of just sort of thoughts and questions. The first about the two squares. I think partly my question is I would love to know more about what kind of an organization Fundación Mi Parque is. And again, how they position themselves within the different network, because in a way I have my own suspicions of participatory design and advocacy planning. This looks like a successful example, I think in part because of a fairly high level of sophistication about the design expertise that's deployed on site. And you talked about the way in which the plaza itself was kind of redefined in that process of operation. The second one about Valparaiso, I think really a kind of extraordinary project, one which I think is a kind of exemplary model for thinking of the city as a geographical or a geological entity, and I mean the kind of extraordinary role that the topography plays in Valparaiso, but then to suggest that by working with that topography and structuring it more precisely, even to the extent of the invention of the prefabricated pieces and so on, it seems to me there's a very, very high degree of design intelligence operating in a kind of larger contextual field of a deep understanding of that particular city and its potentials. I think, I mean, my question there, again, are really more at the level of implementation, that conventional definitions of property tend to be bounded, and that's very often a problem that we run up against as architects and urban designers. And to be you could almost say that the most important design proposition on the table there is the definition of the site in terms of its geography, rather than a typical bounded piece of property. So I want to know more about that, and how that happened. Again, there's a kind of sub-theme in all three, which is the negotiation with the various bureaucratic structures, and surely, I mean, you underscored that in the final project, but surely that had to be intense in the case of the Valparaíso. In some ways, with the third project, I'm in more familiar territory, in part because we actually participated in the competition, so I know something of the details of the site. But also, although I think you are quite careful to not to roll it into a kind of larger emphasis on landscape urbanism, and I think you're correct there. I think nevertheless some of those issues need to be addressed, and I think that's a little bit where I would differentiate between we don't need to get into the history of landscape urbanism, but landscape urbanism seems to me is a response to very specific characteristics of the North American city, and I think the way in which the design moves were very specific to Santiago and its topography were very, very important there. The question that I have, and again, I think you gave a tentative answer in your epilogue, which I also very much appreciated. I mean, I think the framing of the presentation was very strong, and the epilogue played a very important role there, where you again kind of restated the importance of taking a large-scale kind of geological perspective on the city. I have my doubts, and these are doubts in some sense about some of my own practices, that landscape is so often called upon for a kind of mediating role, to kind of soften conflict and absorb conflict, that landscape is soft material and it absorbs conflict. And I don't know, maybe again in the Chilean context it's too well known, but the history of the stadium during the dictatorship, I mean, this is a highly fraught and conflict-ridden place, and I think the design that you showed, in some sense, precisely as I'm understanding the parts of the design that are causing problems with the bureaucracy, which are in fact the built parts, I appreciate those, but I still wonder if if the landscape strategy that's fundamentally operating within a kind of horizontal register can ever fully counteract the monumental presence of the stadium. So I want to kind of, on the one hand, endorse the landscape and the geological strategies, but leave that question on the table. What are the limits of the landscape strategies when faced with a big monumental piece of architecture like that? So.
I think there are many questions in Stan's assessment of your presentation, and I'm going to frame the response starting with the last question that I think is the most provocative. First, I think these forums are very valuable to frame the discourse for what you will do in Chile and what we will continue doing at Columbia and in the other institutions. So the question that I think, let me interpret Stan's last question, is given an international competition for a significant site, such as a stadium, and is it, can you let something like landscape that is a more less nuanced, less it's a local problem, but at a different scale of politics. So that if you have politics and landscape to kind of condition a response of public space, the one of the stadiums seemed to be conditioning the response, a more neutral response towards landscape and less towards a kind of political statement. In a way, it's kind of even the relationship to Sao Paulo makes it kind of a traditional Latin American landscape response. So could you respond to Stan's question, basically, how do you see the project for the stadium as what were the main design variables that were addressed by that response, by that design?
Okay. Oh, I have a lot of questions in my little notepad. And if I may, I would like to start from the first one,
Sure.
just to be provocative. Coming back to that. Do you want to say something?
Which was the first? No,
No, whatever. Okay, sure. No, it's about. I will follow your order regarding the three projects, and I'll end up with that one. I hope. So the first one, it's about Fundación Mi Parque. When you were asking about the organizational, what kind of organization is Fundación Mi Parque? And I would say that the success is basically based on the fact that they create the network. So they have a high level of sophistication in creating that, in organizing the people, the community, the people who will pay for the projects. My conflict in a way is that having that high level, they should be able now, in my opinion at least, to convey that into an actual design proposal. Because it's very, simplistic maybe, that when you make a link about defining a landscape project as a collection of natural elements such as trees, grass, some soil or something like that. So in terms of that, I would say only that about it. About Valparaíso, I think it's super complicated. One of the designers who is actually here in the audience explained to me that precisely the issue of property lines was extremely complicated. They received a plan, an official plan from the municipality, which was not correct. So they had to readjust and create a new plan in order to work on top of that. So then you have these sort of boundary lines between official information and the actual reality that becomes,
Well, yeah, another point I wrote down, I like very much that three-dimensional model, and we haven't talked too much about this, but the two-dimensional plan, which is the municipality's plan, is completely inadequate to deal with Valparaíso, and part of the expertise we can bring is a kind of creativity about inventing new forms of representation.
Absolutely, yeah. And that takes me to the last question, I think. I think it's tricky because on one side the project is not built. I have doubt if it's going to be totally built. Right now they are building the eastern side for the Juegos Panamericanos. I don't know. And part of the discussion, of course, has been the topic that you put on the table regarding the historical value of the stadium as a detention place in the 70s. So that stage has addressed that situation, and one of the promenades that gets into the actual Coliseum, it's called the Memory Route. So basically, it's kind of eclectic though, because you will see that part built with, the fields, the baseball thing, and then you have the Media Luna for horses, and then in between you have this part of the project. And I'm saying this because if you have a project in 5 stages and you are not sure about the fact that you'll see all of them built at some point, it's complicated to address what you're saying about the meaning of landscape in a site like that, because I do believe that it is a project that responds from a landscape project strategy and define a whole site for the first time.
Sure. No, I mean, I think there's 2 interesting things about that. I mean, one is I think you're absolutely correct to, again, it's a representation problem. You're absolutely correct to say that it depends on it getting built, because one of the things is that subtle changes in topography that don't register in drawings and don't register at an architectural scale can actually be very powerful in the landscape context. So, again, it's easy to, you look at the photograph of the model and it looks flat, but it may very well be that the experience is much more complex and rich, and, but we can't necessarily know that. But of course, the other, I mean, landscape also has a traditional association with memory and memorial as well. So again, it's, I mean, that's one of the things that landscape has traditionally done.
And then you can contest the notion of a monument if you start by thinking that, because I don't believe that you necessarily need to have, I don't know, sort of a statue or something reminding you about what happened there. Right?
Yeah, I mean, just let me be clear. I mean, my question wasn't necessarily tied to that particular aspect of its history. It was really more a kind of I don't want to say a technical question, but an architectural question that, I mean, even if there weren't that particular history, the capacity of landscape to reconfigure the site is limited precisely by the power of that, just the size and the presence of that large piece of structure. It was really more that as a kind of, again, in the spirit of what are the tools available to us. In other words, if we strictly limit ourselves to the tools of landscape, architecture is always going to win.
But you're basically saying that what are the tools available to intervene? That's one question, and apply to all. What space it leaves for others?
Right.
And I think that also, for a project of that magnitude, what is the space that is left for others? If it remains incomplete, what are the opportunities to plan it to be completed, not necessarily by the architect, or allowing other actors to intervene? What kind of organizations are formed to do, like you asked about what kind of organization is Fundación Mi Parque, but what kind of organizations can or are formed around this type of public space projects? Because we are not talking about parks, we are talking about public space, so that these interactions between different groups. And then the other question is that you mentioned, Stan, that there are some kind of similarities or relationships between public space in Latin American cities and public spaces in North American cities, but that the landscape seem different. Like here, it's more benevolent, considered more benevolent. Is that what you meant? There, it's more like.
Well, actually, I think that, I mean, I kept thinking this was Los Angeles or something, I think the similarity, and I'm speaking really more of Santiago at this point, and you're free to tell me I'm absolutely wrong, by the way, too. But I think it's at the level of the sort of larger organization of the city and the basic sort of tissue in the fabric. I don't think it's so much the public spaces, actually. Okay. I think, again, the public spaces are something quite specific to South American city. But again, I mean, look, we could probably have this landscape discussion. He was for questions. Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, just let me say really
Go
briefly.
ahead.
Again, again, is that I think it's a. I mean, maybe I'll be like, I can borrow the Saskia's sense that when you need to deal with spaces that can allow the public to intervene, can support many programs, it's too easy to say, well, landscape does that.
Exactly.
And my worry there is that then we're losing sight of some of the specific capacities of architecture, and perhaps sometimes we actually have to accept the fact that if architecture creates partitions and separations and breaks up some of the continuity of that space, maybe sometimes we need to do that. Maybe it's not always good for everything to be open and connected and flow. So.
Well, I think it also brings back to the point that Luis was making before, where the more you see as an architect, or the more you engage as an architect, the more you go towards politics, or to understand the process. And I think this is intention with what you're saying. You're saying we have specific tools, but on the other hand, it's like your specific tools end in the implementation of
Sure.
them, so that there is a kind of like a barrier between them. And then the other kind of question, just and this is open to others, is to the idea of public space, public and private space. It seems like a paradigm from years ago, and that now we could think about commons and common space and individualized space, or singular space, so that the space of the campus of a university, for example, if it's one university, it could be considered singular, not necessarily public. Or the space of a corporation it may be accessible to all, but it may be singular to the entity that has the majority of it. So that public space may need to, like the Valparaiso example, seems like a very public space because it's the right of way, it's a street. But other spaces could become more singular in their distinction. Do you see in Romy, do you see in Santiago a tendency for public spaces to be singular or to be more commonly planned?
Again, someone said at the very beginning that the division of the conference in these three labels was complicated. I think we got to that point here. Because, of course, public space, I mean, that's why I showed that map also from 1910, because you have a combination of both. And I do believe that Santiago was pretty much balanced as a city at the time, because you had those singular pieces, and then you have all the connectivity elements, which were also public spaces. So the importance of that plan, for me at least, is that you can see that those singular pieces were not just, stylistic, traditional landscape designs, as sometimes we probably think of them as architects, or urban planners or whatever. But they had an urban role within the city.
But they were also, if I'm understanding, they were linked up into a network.
Exactly,
They were
that's what I'm saying. So
network.
that's what I'm saying.
Exactly,
so that you have the singular pieces, and then you have the connectivity elements, which were also publics. The thing now is that, I think you can recreate that from the dots in the Fundación Mi Parque map, that basically they recognize these, conflict sites. And they are isolated within their communities. Right. They respond to probably a neighbor, a group of houses, and that would be it. But then you don't see them as a public space network for the city. So
no, that was a bit what was behind my question.
Are there questions from the audience? Yes, Clara.
「 One comment, one question. I just wanted to restate Romy's notion of the importance of process with the first project, but not necessarily that doesn't happen necessarily at the detriment of product. So if we heard from Luis Eduardo how process was at a deficit in Chile in general, in this case we go to the other extreme, and what we need to strike for is a balance between the two. And then in the first panel I asked the question about the role of disasters in grand plan making. And my question regarding the stadium project here would be, what is the role of mega projects, a national stadium, and the role of mega events, the Pan American Games, in the search for this global city positioning that Santiago is after?
I think in a way this project responds to, I don't know, a hidden crisis, which is, you showed that in your presentation about, the difference between the incomes in the population, right? So in a way they arrive, not all of them of course, but the Valparaiso project for sure, and the Squares projects too, they are trying to solve a problem that is hidden, that we not necessarily see on a daily basis, but it's there, and it's extended. In the case of the National Stadium, yeah, you can say it's a mega project in comparison with the others that are being built, but it's only 160 acres, you know, that's 64 hectares for us. If we go to the definition of large parks in the book, they would tell you that you need to think about projects of 500 acres or more. So it's more, I don't know how to respond to your question actually, because I don't believe it's a mega project. I honestly don't believe it's going to have a mega impact because I'm afraid that the only part that will be built would be that side it was highlighted in the slide, which is nothing. And then we will come back again to the main goal of the competition, which was to provide a master plan for a site that didn't have one, just a stadium and scattered fragments with other installations around it, you know, but without any criteria or design criteria or organizational criteria. So I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really important question, and I think it really speaks to the some of the fundamental questions of urban design today. I mean, I think we all, as architects, we want to think that there's a kind of abstract notion of civic good and that these kinds of projects are done to improve cities. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that there is a global culture of spectacle and communication and cities and these mega events that position cities and call attention to cities, and also are the triggers to finance projects. Today you can't separate. I mean, it's the Barcelona model, it's the Olympics model. I mean, large-scale infrastructure investments tend to be made when there's some kind of large-scale spectacle. And I think we have to get sort of comfortable with that, accept it, and then find ways to leverage that in a kind of positive way rather than try and resist it.
And I think it is a mega project from the outside. To me, it is a mega project. It has a significant component. It's large enough. It was done by international competition. It's something we know. And I think that the main objective of this pairing of mega project, mega events is to create a narrative. And I think it's a political narrative. And coming back from Asia, from Tokyo in the last week, one of the things that was very clear to me that I think it's relevant to this discussion is to which level cities within a region compete for the spotlight by using architecture and urbanism to this end. And so I think that that would guarantee that a project would be done, that once you start it, you do it, and that once you do it right, and once you do it right, the designer has the most power within that narrative in leveling, kind of in working the politics and the landscape. The landscape is what you use to get the project, but politics is what you use to make the narrative.
So let me restate what I said. I would love for the authorities to understand this project as a mega project. The problem is that's not the thing, you know? And when you ask about the organizational conditions surrounding it, there's none. I mean, basically, Luis Eduardo said in his presentation that there's the main government deciding things, and then you win a competition, and then you have to start all over again with the second client, you know, and that's the situation here, and that's the complication. So what I'm just saying is that I love for people to understand in the way you are doing it, but it's not as simple or as clear as that.
I see. Any other questions?
I'd like to reconvene to 440, so I don't know if I have time for which would be a very short question. The question would be, do you have information of what is the Foundation Mi Parque? Who are the advisory board, or even how do they get the sponsorship? And the question is triggered by being a skeptic in general of the third sector taking care of what should be either public or even private. The parks seem the projects seem to be very interesting, but I would be suspicious that even real estate operations can create foundations to do that, because you raise the value of land, and then if you buy before the park and sell after the park, then you got a very good deal. So I don't know if you have some information.
Yeah, you're asking for who is Fundación Mi Parque?
Yeah.
Actually, it's a group of social entrepreneurs, I would say. It's a group of people who got together and decided that they, because of their contacts with other statements of society, they could go to them and ask for resources to do a social good. So in a way, they are trying to do what you said. Sure. It's not possible, but in a way they are trying to do that, right? So it's a non-profit organization, and basically it's a core of people in charge, I don't know, talking and asking for that money, and they have a lot of people working there, young people, actually, architects, designers, and that sort of person. But it's super simple in a way.
But I think this reiterates something that Galia was saying, that the interesting and potentially productive work that's happening out there is not strictly speaking public, strictly speaking private.
No.
It's new mixtures and creative ways of kind of redefining the limit between the public and private, and I think that's where you have to go.
And to canalize the funds, you know, because they know where the money is and they are moving it towards where it's needed. So that's the biggest creation there.
Another question, or we wrap it up? Very well. Thank you very much.
What's that? 20 minutes is good.